Here we go. Hey everybody, I am Alex with Wild Montana Action Fund. Back with you again after a good delay between our first video and this video. But it is my pleasure today to be joined by Kayje Booker, who is Wild Montana Action Fund's Deputy Director, if I got that right. Hey, Kayje, how are you?
Hey, Alex, I'm good. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing all right. Just another Tuesday here in the office. But the reason Kij and I are chatting for a couple of minutes today is to talk about Wild Montana Action Fund's newest bucket of work, which is Montana election reform. It sounds a little bit intimidating, I think. In reality, it's actually a lot simpler than the title that we've given it makes it sound. But Kej is gonna walk us through some of the basics, what it is, why it matters, how it affects public lands specifically. And I think the best place to start, Kasia, is, you know, why does election reform matter? What problem is this trying to solve?
Yeah, that's a good question, Alex. And I think, a lot of people have their own perspectives on how they're feeling about elections in this country right now. But I think there's a couple things that we know that are pretty consistent. One is that we're seeing partisanship at levels that are previously unimaginable. We're seeing people sort of bunkered down into their own camps, really having trouble seeing areas of connection, areas of agreement between one camp and the other, one party and the other. Another that we see really here in Montana that these reforms are trying to address is the lack of choice that folks are feeling. A lot of our elections in Montana, especially at the legislative level, have either just one candidate by the time you get to the general election, or they're districts that are drawn in such a way that they're so heavily tilted towards one party or the other that it's sort of guaranteed whoever wins the primary election is going to win the general election. And the problem with that is that only a very small percentage of people vote in our primary elections. So what we're seeing is that there's a disproportionate power in the primary election at a point where not a lot of people are voting, and a lot of the people that are voting are the hardest partisans, the most extreme folks in their party. And that's leading to some of what I was just talking about with the partisanship. And it's leading to people feeling in a lot of these districts like they just don't really have the options that they want when they get their ballot in November.
Thanks. So to make sure I've got that right, election reform will essentially or the goals of election reform, I should say, are to diminish, hardcore partisanship, first of all, and then give people more choice in who they actually vote for. Am I sort of understanding that correctly?
Yeah, that's right. So, how it works now is in the primary in Montana, I think in the Western District this year, you maybe received 4 different ballots for the primary. And then you had to pick which of those you were going to vote. And the others just got thrown in the garbage. And so even though there were a whole host of candidates across all of those ballots, you only got to vote for one ballot. And if you live in a district in which the general election is not going to be competitive, what that means is that you didn't have the opportunity to switch back and forth and say, oh, I maybe like this person for the presidential, but I like this person from a different party for my legislative district. That person knocked on my door. I know them. They're great. You have to vote straight party line because it's all on a single, each party is on a separate ballot. And so with election reform, what these reforms would do is you would have a top 4 primary ballot or top 4 primary election, which means on the primary ballot, on one ballot, you would see all of the different candidates from all of the different parties, and you would get to vote in such a way that it would allow you to vote for people from different parties or independents or whatever you wanted to do, however you wanted to mix and match. You can vote for the candidate that you like the most for every single office on your primary ballot. And again, that's really important in districts where the primary election is the one that matters. A lot of folks feel like they would like more options in the primary, especially when that's the election that's essentially going to decide who wins, because the general election is either not going to have some additional candidates in particular races, or because it's just not going to be competitive.
And so when you say it's not going to be competitive, you mean that a particular election in a particular district, it's decided more on a party line than it is based on the qualities of an individual candidate. So like in one place, like, the Republican candidate is going to win regardless. And in another place, the Democrat is going to win regardless. So this would, in theory, like not lock people into voting, voting a strict party line ballot, but provide more choice. Is that sort of the idea?
Yeah, so I believe it's 88 of Montana's 100 House districts, the general election was decided by more than 10 points, or there was only a single candidate in the general election. So that's what I mean by non-competitive general elections. Like if you're in a heavily Republican district that's going to vote, 60-40 Republican in the general, then whoever makes it out of that Republican primary is going to be the winner of your district. And the same goes for Democratic districts, in parts of Missoula, for example, whoever makes it out of that Democratic primary is going to win in the general. It's pretty much, I don't want to say impossible, but it's highly improbable in some of these districts that lean very far right or very far left for somebody from the other party to win in the general election. And so what this would allow is so it's top four. So the top four getters in the primary make it onto the general ballot. So you could have two Republicans on your general ballot. Let's say you live in a very red district. Whoever in our current system, whoever wins that primary for the Republicans is going to win the general. In this new system, you could end up with two Republicans on the general election ballot, two Republicans and a Democrat, two Republicans, a Democrat, and an independent. And having all of those choices means that even if a Republican is still going to win in that district, you have the choice between two different Republicans. Currently, that choice only happens in the primary. Only Republican voters get to choose between those two Republicans. This allows the entire general election electorate to choose between those two Republicans or those two Democrats. And so you can choose somebody that's a hardline conservative, or you can choose a more moderate conservative. Or if you're a Democrat and you have two Democrats on your general election ballot, you have that same choice to make on the progressive end. And so that means, a couple of things. It means that voters have more choice. It also means that we are giving power to the general election electorate, which is where most people vote. And so instead of keeping the power in the hands of the 30% of people or whatever that are voting in the primary election, we're putting the power back in the hands of the 80% of people that are going to vote in the general election, and making sure that those people have the choice that we're now restricting to the people in the primary election.
Okay, I think I understand that. And I think I saw somewhere too that only about a third of voters vote in the primaries. So then you end up with, if you have these non-competitive general election races, like you've been talking about, essentially the 30% of people who voted in any given primary have already chosen who is going to win that election.
Exactly. And it's even less than that, Alex, because it's only the percentage of those that have voted in the primary for the party that controls that district.
Right.
So yeah, it's a very small number of people that are ultimately choosing who's going to represent that district.
Got it.
And the thing that's important about that too, beyond choice, and beyond sort of general principles of our democracy, Is also that then these leaders are really beholden to that small slice of the electorate. They know that to win, they have to appeal to that 30% or that 15% that are voting in their party's primary. And that really shapes the way that they act in office, the way that they think about how to approach different bills, different policies, as they know they need to appeal to that very small slice of the electorate rather than the entire group of their constituents that are going to vote in the general election.
Got it. Okay. Well, I think we've already started like down this rabbit hole a little bit, but before we go too far into the specifics, what are the actual two ballot initiatives that we're talking about here that would, start us down this election reform route?
Yeah. So there's two, like you said, constitutional amendments. One is the top four primary, which I mentioned already, which means that the top four candidates, regardless of party, top four vote getters, regardless of party, make it out of the primary onto the general election ballot. So if there's, two Republicans, two Democrats, two independents running, the top four from among that group are going to make the general election ballot. The other is majority winner. So the problem with having four people on a general election ballot is that somebody could win with 26% of the vote. And I think we would all agree that that is not the ideal situation. And so the majority winner is to deal with that situation and ensure that it doesn't happen by requiring that for somebody to win the general election, they have to get at least 50% of the vote. So if there are more than two people on the general election ballot, and the vote splits in such a way that nobody gets 50%, then there will have to be some way to get to 50%. And the legislature actually gets to make that decision. This constitutional amendment would not set the method by which that happens. That would actually be something that the legislature in the next session would figure out and implement then before the next election.
Okay. And is there a menu of a couple different options that the legislature can choose from in that scenario? Or are they sort of free to do whatever?
They're not free to do whatever they want. They can't say, whoever's name starts with A is the winner. They can't do something like that. Sorry, Alex. What they can do,
Alphabetically, I would do pretty well.
you would.
I'd
You'd
have a
have a good
shot.
shot. Um, they really have just a couple of options. One is instant runoff. So in that situation, you're actually ranking the candidates as you vote for them. So you're saying, I like Alex number one, I like Kayje number two, I like whoever else 3 and 4. And then as the votes are tallied, it allows you to round by round kind of drop off the lowest vote getter. And then if you voted for the person that got the least number of votes, then your second place vote is what gets counted. So this is a way to end up at above 50% because you whittle it down kind of to the top two and then the top one. This is the method that Alaska uses, for example. The other would be a later runoff. So this would be something like what we see in Georgia, where you would actually have a second election where the top two vote getters would be the only ones on the ballot. And that could happen late in November, early in December, and it would be just a whole nother election where for every office that didn't reach the majority in the first election, you would just have the top two vote getters and people would be deciding between them.
Okay. And that would be down to the legislature to decide if the ballot initiatives are approved by voters?
Yes.
Okay. Got it. Okay. And the idea, I see how that would, reduce polarization if people have to appeal to more than just that, that narrow subset of primary voters. If you're trying to theoretically, be someone's second choice, you don't want to go alienating a whole bunch of folks. That seems logical. Okay.
Exactly.
I think I got it all. Last question then, and I think this is sort of This is a cruxy one. For our work in particular, you've done a super helpful job explaining, the substance of the ballot initiatives and how they would work and why they matter. But one thing that I'm curious about is how they would matter for public lands specifically. I think this is not, necessarily something where it's immediately obvious why a public lands advocacy organization like Wild Montana Action Fund would be doing election reform. So could you walk me through that a little bit?
Yeah, it's a really good question and one we've thought about a lot. And, when you look at surveys about voters and public lands, what you see is that a supermajority of voters care about public lands and want to protect public lands in Montana. And it's across party lines. It's across demographics. It's across the state. This is an issue that appeals to a really broad swath of Montanans. But like I was talking about earlier, the situation we're in right now, in which primary voters have so much control, means that a lot of our elected officials, in order to get reelected, are paying the most attention to the policy ideas and preferences of that small slice of the electorate that's voting in their party's primary. And so concerns like public lands, on which there's broad agreement, but maybe some of the most extreme partisans have different ideas or don't care about the issue, end up being ones that are left behind, or end up being ones that get this kind of radical treatment where, again, elected officials are pandering, maybe that's too strong a word, or paying attention at least to the preferences of that really small group, who have, policies that they care deeply, deeply about. And those end up being the ones that these elected officials are focusing on. Or they have sort of extreme ideas about public lands, and elected officials would love to do something that aligns with the values of their district as a whole, but in order to make it through the primary, they have to take on the positions of this small group of voters. And we hear that in the state legislature. We actually hear that from people that are serving, that they feel hamstrung by their primary electorate and by needing to make sure that they have those votes, even though they know that the majority of their constituents care about other things or would prefer that they take different positions on those issues.
Wow.
But that's not who elects them. It's this slice of the primary electorate. And so that's who they have to pay attention to if they want to stay in office.
Wow. Politics at its best, huh? Um,
It's dysfunctional, but there's a fix. I mean, these are really inspirational, exciting amendments. They give me a lot of hope for what politics could look like in the future. I think they would really fundamentally change how elected officials approach their work in a way that is going to benefit issues like public lands that are broadly popular and have support across the parties.
mhm. Wow. Okay. So to make sure I've got this, the proposed election reform ballot initiatives would, to summarize it very briefly, help make our help make the positions that our elected officials hold more representative of the views of actual Montanans, the people they're supposed to represent. And because those views would then be more representative of Montanans, they would, how to say this, place more value on the public lands issues that are really, broadly popular across the political and demographic and geographic spectrum. Is that about right?
Exactly. Yeah. And for a group like Wild Montana Action Fund, that does a lot of work in elections, we are going to have more options with our supporters to be able to pressure different candidates, because we're going to be able to make that decision in the general election with this broad swath of Montanans that really care about this issue. And so it'll give organizations like ours a better chance to get our issues in front of elected officials and to put the pressure on them that we need to to make sure that the stances that they're taking, the decisions that they're making in office align with the public land values that the majority of their constituents hold.
Boom, right there. Okay, well, I don't know that there's a better place to end than that. Thank you for walking me through all of this. That's been super enlightening and helpful for me. I'm sure it will be helpful and enlightening for other people as well. If you do want to learn anything more about this, we'll put some links alongside this video. Feel free to click those, explore. If you do have questions, you can always get in touch with us directly, and we'll be happy to answer whatever we can. Well, Kayje, thanks again for taking a couple minutes today. Really grateful. This was super helpful. And yeah, thanks. Looking forward to seeing what happens next.
All right. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you. Bye.